people of the United States. A house divided against itself cannot stand. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Hello, and welcome to George Washington Slept Here, the civic education podcast from Freedom's Foundation at Valley Forge, where we explore American history, civics, and the idea of liberty through conversations with some of our favorite thinkers, writers, and leaders. I'm Jason Raia, Chief Operating Officer at Freedom's Foundation and host of George Washington Slept Here. The format is simple, a long-form conversation with a friend of Freedom's Foundation where everyone can learn something new. Before we go any further, a little housekeeping. We encourage everyone to subscribe to George Washington Slept Here wherever you listen to podcasts, and make sure you get every new episode as soon as it is out. We love hearing from our listeners, so please email us at gwshpodcast@gmail.com with your comments, questions, or suggestions, and hit us up at Freedom's Foundation's social media at FFVF on Twitter, and on Facebook and Instagram at Freedom's Foundation. Today's interview is with the Director of Public Advocacy at the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, Aaron Terr. Hello, Aaron.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Great to have you here. Our conversation today is going to be structured just to keep us on track. We want to explore your origin story and how you became the person sitting here before us, your current work at FIRE, and then we're going to talk about some of the cases and issues that FIRE is dealing with in the arena of the First Amendment. And finally, we will end with a quiz, which hopefully means we will learn something about you that we did not know. So, Aaron, where were you born and raised?
I was born in Bayshore, New York. Grew up there. Actually, the title of this podcast kind of reminded me of a little landmark in my hometown. It's called Sacticos Manor. It's this estate that the British used as headquarters during the Revolutionary War.
Oh, very cool.
And after the war, George Washington, when he was president, he was touring Long Island, and he actually stayed over there one night. And when you drive by, there's a sign outside that says, George Washington slept here, 1790.
I love it. That's exactly the reason. And we haven't really talked about this, but that's a perfect example of why we wanted to name the podcast George Washington Slept Here. There is this neat phenomenon that George Washington, as he traveled the country, of course, this is pre-hotels, but he would stay in, taverns and rooming houses and what have you. And all of those people were so proud and so happy to proclaim that George Washington had slept there that they emblazoned it on brass plaques, and they'd had neon lights. They would have put it in neon lights. And it's really because George Washington was the great uniter of the country. Like, he brought everyone together. Everyone believed in George Washington. And of course, after him, parties form, and there's no single individual that draws the country together in the way that George Washington does. And that just got us thinking, that we need to find what it is that makes us Americans. And certainly George Washington has been part of that, but what is it for the 21st century? And we thought exploring that, it just worked for our name. So it's just, that's great. That's really neat that in your hometown is one of those places.
There is, yeah. It's always just a cool feeling to be in a place like that, and you can kind of visualize them actually being there.
Yeah, exactly.
Like a couple centuries ago, and what the scene was inside. When you go into Independence Hall, where the Constitutional Convention took place, and it just gives you, it fills me with this kind of sense of awe. And to actually be in that space where these things happened.
Right. And we certainly have come to believe that historic place is really important. And there's nothing that replaces being in a spot like Independence Hall or here in Valley Forge or, in Bayshore, New York, where you're like, he was here. They were here. And we do that with students when we bring them to historic sites. And it is incredible to see a young student who has read about someplace and now is standing there. And just what a powerful moment it is, and how important those kinds of experiences are in connecting all of us together, that this is something shared amongst us. And so I'm a big advocate for bringing young people. So you grow up in New York. This is Long Island, or
Long Island, yeah.
So who were your influences then? Who were the important people who were sort of, maybe not, you didn't realize at the moment, but were sort of driving you down the path that you would end up at eventually? Yeah,
well, it's funny. I mean, I had a real zigzag path to coming to what I do now. I always was a big fan of stand-up comedy.
Okay.
And I just remember, being young, my parents loved George Carlin.
Sure.
And I think I would maybe mark that as kind of the first thing in my life that exposed me to the idea of free speech and why it's important.
Those
right?
seven forbidden words.
The 7 words. I won't say them right now.
No.
But
the good thing is in podcasts, we don't have to worry about like the FTC.
Well, that's true. Maybe I should say them, but I don't know I don't know if you want
our
to be
audience
more
might not
family-friendly.
appreciate it, but
but it just listening to my dad had actual records of his albums. And I remember listening to those, and I thought he was just hilarious, even when at a young age, like 12 or 13, and also just extremely perceptive, in a way that few comedians I think are, and he had so many great bits about language too. I mean, so he had, like you mentioned, his own run-ins with censorship, and then he just had great actual comedic bits about language. And sort of the way that we police language in our culture. And, he has this great bit on euphemisms and how they can conceal reality and conceal the real impact of an idea or concept or phenomenon. And I just love the example where he goes from, uses the example of shell shock in World War I, and how that became battle fatigue during World War II. Then it became, I think, operational exhaustion.
Oh, wow.
And then finally with the Vietnam War, and he's like, and now we're up to 6 syllables or whatever. And then finally with the Vietnam War, post-traumatic stress disorder.
Right. But yeah, that's fascinating that here is this beloved, revered comic who, as a young kid, you obviously know he's funny, but there's that deeper thing with language and specifically with censorship that at least nudges you toward a life that you had no idea you'd be working for a First Amendment advocacy shop as an adult. So you go to Vassar. Yeah. And what did you study?
So I studied biology at Vassar. And the other thing my dad has been an influence in my life too.
Yeah.
And he's always been very interested in the natural world.
Sure.
He loves birds, insects, spiders. He's probably the only person I know who loves spiders, and plants. And so I sort of inherited that same interest from him, particularly an interest in evolutionary biology.
Okay.
He would have.
Okay.
I remember in high school reading this book called What Evolution Is by Ernst Mayr, famous evolutionary biologist, that my dad had in the house, and just being fascinated with that topic and understanding how all these different species came to be the way that they are. And I kind of that's what led me to major in biology in college. And I wanted to be a scientist for a while. That was kind of the path I was on. But I became disillusioned with that after college when I was working a couple of internships on scientific research projects, these forest ecology experiments. I was out in Wisconsin and then I was up in northern Manitoba, Canada, working on these projects, going out in the field collecting
sure
data.
It just wasn't the climate that turned you off
Manitoba. I actually managed to get out of there in mid-November before it gets too insane.
Before you got stuck there until May?
If you're there in January, February, it's every day it's like 25 below. But it was, it was an interesting experience. I can't say that I loved it. There were things at the same time, I don't think that I would take it back because there were parts of it that were, I got to see Aurora Borealis many nights up there. One of the most amazing things I've ever seen in my life. But I did realize that I don't think I want to do this as a career. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's what led me to to go to law school. And so I was thinking I can kind of use my science background and my interest on the policy side to pursue environmental law.
Okay.
And so that was kind of a loose
That would have been an
intention.
interesting marriage of your studies and your field work with this idea of going to law school.
Right.
But George Carlin's still in the back of your head.
He's still in the back of my head. But and when I got to law school, and this is kind of a complaint I have about, and I've heard it from other people, other lawyers, that you not only do law schools tend to not encourage you to look into First Amendment and free speech advocacy as a career option, they even can sometimes actively discourage it or make it seem like it's a fun thing to study while you're in law school, and maybe you can even do the First Amendment clinic, but so few people make an actual career out of it. There's just not that many opportunities. And to be fair, I mean, I don't think there aren't compared to something like corporate law. But as I now actually at FIRE look to hire somebody to join my department, I actually think back to that and think, I'm trying to find somebody who's a perfect fit. And I wouldn't mind if, there were more people out there that were interested in this type of work.
Yeah.
But
that
anyway,
had realized it in law school that this was an area of interest and had pursued it more, but they're not being encouraged to. Do you think that's generally true in law schools of con law in general, or the First Amendment more so? Because it feels like, not having gone to law school, I wonder, is a better way to say it. I wonder if it is more that sort of career track, whether you're going toward tax and corporate law or litigation and criminal law or any number of the types of law, but whereas con law is fairly theoretical and, again, like you said, that's great to argue about, but is there a career there? But that, for those who could have a career there, leaves them at a bit of a disadvantage.
Right. Yeah, I think that's true. But it is also true that most people who go to law school, certainly most people who I went to law school with, they ended up wanting to pursue careers in big law or in criminal law. That may not have been what they said that they wanted to do when they when they applied, or when they arrived.
That wasn't in their personal essay.
Yeah. I can't wait to defend large corporations. But the money's pretty tempting, and
sure,
and it can be interesting and fascinating work for sure.
I have no doubt.
So I don't want to denigrate it, but I was doing I did the environmental law clinic. I interned at an environmental law nonprofit, and I just didn't find the work that exciting.
Connect.
It just did not. Yeah, it didn't excite me.
Yeah.
And so I ended up taking a judicial clerkship after law school, and I worked in that position for several years. And I kind of figured this is a way I can keep sampling different areas of law,
right,
and kind of figure out what area I ultimately want to specialize in. So as a clerk, you work for a judge, and it's a fun gig. I got to write draft opinions in cases coming up on appeal. This is the Pennsylvania Superior Court. It's the state's intermediate appellate court.
Right. So this is above Court of Common Pleas, which is sort of your entry level court. So they're deciding cases that have been appealed.
That's right. And it's general jurisdiction, so criminal cases, civil cases of all kinds, with the exception of a few that are under the jurisdiction of the sister Commonwealth Court. So there's actually two courts you can appeal to after the Common Pleas, and then above those appeals go to the state Pennsylvania Supreme Court.
Right.
So I'm sandwiched in between.
So this is real. I think most people might find, I don't know if anybody finds it as fascinating as I do, but the idea that how old are you out of law school that you are helping to draft opinions for the Pennsylvania Appellate Court?
I would have been 27 years old when I started. So I had a couple of years in between college and law school. So
how does that work? Does the because again, I'm just fascinated by this. Does the judge hears this and what? How does it get to the stage that you as a clerk are drafting something that of course needs to be representative of what the judge thinks?
For sure, yeah. And so in the beginning, you really are very closely supervised in all the writing and research that you're doing to ensure that sort of alignment. So the cases come up on appeal. Actually, only a small percentage of them are argued so orally before the court. Most are just submitted on the written briefs. So you read the briefs, and then you have the record, the certified record from the trial court, all the evidence,
Right.
and other stuff that the trial court considered. And that could be a small manila folder. It could be 20 boxes, cardboard boxes full of stuff. But you look, and in that case, you're just looking kind of for like the relevant parts of the record that are needed to decide the issues of law that are on appeal. So like I said in the beginning, I would read the briefs, look through the record, and then I would meet with the chief clerk and or the judge to discuss the case and what we think the outcome, what I think the outcome should be, and then they tell me if I'm wrong.
Right.
And then kind of talk through, what the opinion should look like. And then, you write a first draft. And then, of course, they review it. And it might be, you might get sent back to you like, no, this has to be rewritten or heavily edited.
Right. Or you forgot about this, or you should have included that.
Yeah. But judges, and I don't know how many people even know necessarily that almost every judge has at least one law clerk, because Pennsylvania actually, for whatever reason, has the busiest docket of any state in the country.
Oh, that's interesting.
At least that was true when I was clerking. And so it's just nearly impossible for one judge to review all these cases and write the first drafts of all these opinions in the first instance without any help.
Right.
Without any help from clerks. So that's why judges, almost all of them have clerks that assist with these massive caseloads.
Right. And those opinions are the argumentation and the evidence for the decision. But so the judge is making the decision, and then clerks are taking that decision and the evidence that you've discussed and fashioning that into the formal written opinion that will stand.
That's right.
And of course, we know those opinions then go on to influence future cases because they are precedent setting. So you're at the clerkship. How do you wind up at FIRE? Because I want to get to what FIRE does and how you sort of made that turn finally to First Amendment law and advocacy.
Yeah, I think so. While I'm doing this clerkship, I still have that interest in civil liberties. I volunteered for the ACLU for a while, and my first exposure to FIRE was, I believe, the 2015 incident at Yale involving Halloween costumes.
Yes, I think they were Mexican sombreros. Was that the one, or was this a different one?
That's definitely happened too.
I can't keep track of all the things that go on at Yale.
So I'll try to give a quick synopsis here. But this was an infamous incident. It actually involved a Yale administrator sending out an email just advising students to be to be careful about the Halloween costumes that they choose and be careful not to offend their classmates.
Right.
And a Yale professor, Erica Christakis, replied and questioned whether the administration should be getting itself involved in these decisions that students make about what Halloween costumes they want to wear, rather than just leaving them to make those decisions for themselves as adults and to work out any disagreements they have amongst each other.
Right.
And that caused a huge uproar, that they weren't creating a safe space for students. And Erica's husband, Nicholas Christakis, also a professor at Yale, came to her defense. And there's this, you might have seen this video that actually happened to be shot by FIRE President Greg Lukianoff on Yale's campus. He just happened to be there at the time. But these students confronting Nicholas Christakis over this incident, shouting at him, and he's doing his best to try and just kind of calmly engage in dialogue with them. And I just remember thinking that, wow, is this the type of speech that's considered unacceptable on a college campus and at Yale, one of the premier institutions of higher education in the country? I just increasingly became concerned by this growing mindset on college campuses that we should suppress speech that causes offense, that impact of speech matters more than the intent of the speaker, that even equating speech with violence. And and on a college campus of all places, right? The places that are supposed to be dedicated to free thought and free inquiry and advancing human knowledge. Really, I'm just thinking this is the last place, right, that people should be shutting down speech deemed controversial or outside the lines of propriety. I ultimately just and I was also becoming concerned with the way that these ideas were also being exported to the broader society, right, and our institutions. So I kind of came to the realization that this is a cause that I could really dedicate my career to, and I applied to FIRE. I did not get an offer the first time I applied, or the second time for that matter.
Oh wow!
But the third time was the charm. I was also applying for these open staff attorney litigation positions without having any litigation experience, which was probably part of the reason that.
Okay.
But I ultimately ended up getting a position in the campus rights advocacy group.
Okay. And we should stop and say
Sure.
that FIRE original name was the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education.
That's right.
And it is recently, that acronym has remained the same, but it's changed to Expression, which, and we'll get to, and we'll talk about how that has changed things fundamentally. But originally it was all about First Amendment at schools, whether mostly colleges, but then there was this, occasionally there were things that might happen in high school or other things, but it was really around education. And of course, that's important because public schools, any public school is a government entity, and therefore the Constitution holds and the Bill of Rights specifically prohibit First Amendment infringement. And then there are private schools. Tell us about how those two differ a little bit, and then we'll get into the change.
Sure. Private schools aren't bound by the First Amendment because they're not government actors, but many private colleges and universities make promises of free expression and academic freedom because they want to be seen as bastions of free thought, right? And they understand that is critical to the mission of a college or university in producing human knowledge. You need to give wide latitude to your faculty to explore and discuss different ideas.
Including things that might be found offensive by some people, including things that may be a different set of beliefs. I remember I went to a Catholic school, but there was a world religions court. And some people might have found that odd, but it was this idea that we weren't just going to talk about all things Catholic, because there was this idea that in order to be educated, you need to know a wide range of things. And therefore, that idea of freedom to explore was paramount.
Right. And the truth isn't dependent on whether or not something makes somebody uncomfortable or causes them offense.
Right.
Right. And so these private institutions make these promises, they make these commitments, they unfortunately often betray them. And so our argument with those institutions is you should uphold the commitments that you make. You create this expectation for students and faculty that you're going to uphold these principles. And so you may not have to do that under the First Amendment, but you should stick to the principles that you're espousing and in a way that will make you stay faithful to your mission.
So tell us how FIRE works. How does someone come to you, and if you decide, if the organization decides this is a case worth pursuing, what does that mean, and what can happen?
Right. Yeah. So we solicit case submissions from
everywhere.
We'll get to that with the expansion, right? But for 20 years, yes, we were just focused on higher education. So soliciting case submissions from student and faculty who believe that their free speech or due process rights or free association rights or student press rights were violated in some way. We still defend that whole suite of rights in a higher education context. And so when we get a case submission, we review it. We review the facts, any evidence that they provide, and we look at whether or not this is the speech, if it involves speech, right, as opposed to conduct. Sometimes you get submissions that really don't involve speech, so we're not getting involved there. But if it involves speech, the question is really just, is this speech protected, either by the First Amendment at a public institution or under First Amendment standards voluntarily adopted at a private institution? And if so, we defend it, and we can do that in a variety of different ways. We have a litigation team that takes a certain number of case submissions that we receive to court. And there are various factors that go into deciding whether or not a case is a good candidate for litigation. And if we think that it isn't, or we can only litigate so many cases with the amount of resources we have, then we have what I mentioned before, the team I worked on for 2 years, Campus Rights Advocacy Team, formerly known as the Individual Rights Defense Program. And that group engages in non-litigation advocacy. So writing a letter to the institution explaining the violation of the student or faculty member's rights and calling on them to reverse course, publicizing these rights violations by writing them on our website, blasting it out on social media, talking to the media, traditional media, and putting pressure on the institution to do what's right.
So I've noticed since, and it's about a year now that the name change has been in effect, and I've noticed that, so a couple of things that came with that. Number one, I'm sure it was an absolute explosion of cases now, because you've gone from this very narrow, we're doing things in an educational setting, to we'll do these same things anywhere in any setting. But also at the same time, I notice FIRE's name referenced all over the place in media. There's been an advertising campaign here in Philadelphia. I don't know if that's nationwide as well, but there has really been this decision by FIRE to step up and do a whole lot more, it seems like.
That's right. So the expansion has been about 1 year now. And we realized that we had been doing this work on campus for a little over 20 years. And we had a lot of success in that arena. Back in 2006, when we started tracking the number of speech codes, started tracking speech codes at different colleges and universities. And at that time, something like 70% of the schools we surveyed had a policy that clearly and substantially restricted speech protected by the First Amendment. That number is down to about 19% now, in large part thanks to the efforts of our policy reform team, our litigation team, our legislative team. We've notched about 500 advocacy victories on behalf of student and faculty whose rights were violated. But we're witnessing this growing threat to free expression off campus over the past several years, and we realize that there's really a need for a big tent free speech movement that reminds Americans of the importance of not just the First Amendment, but free speech as a cultural value.
Right.
That's something that we actually internalize and believe is important, and we want to see reflected in our institutions and in our daily lives. And we saw a need for an organization that is exclusively dedicated to defending free speech, and both as a constitutional right and as a cultural value. And will do so in a completely nonpartisan way and without apology. And we thought that with all the success we had on campus, that we were well situated to take on that role and to be that organization.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I have been most impressed by is that it really is nonpartisan. So let's dig into the kinds of cases that you all have been looking at now, and I want to start with political speech. In schools, let's start with, sort of your origin. And particularly there seems to be this growing trend of political speech on t-shirts. There are two that you guys have handled recently. One of them is a Let's Go Brandon t-shirt. And then the other is just very recent it's actually ongoing in Massachusetts, where a middle school student wore a shirt that said there are only two genders. And was, told to take it off. He refused. He was sent home. It is in the courts, but I believe FIRE is representing that case. But regardless,
not the two genders,
not the two genders.
The Let's Go Brandon.
But so then I'm conflating the two. But they're both of the same idea that this is political speech on a T-shirt. There is a landmark case, Tinker. based on Mary Beth Tinker, who actually spoke to teachers last summer here at Freedom's Foundation, which is a Vietnam War era case. Tell us about Tinker. Tell us about this issue, and the why fire would get involved with this.
Sure. Tinker involved students who wore black armbands, just plain black armbands, to school in the 1960s to protest the Vietnam War, and they were sent home for that. They challenged that school's decision to discipline them on raising a First Amendment argument. Ultimately went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And this is really the landmark first major case involving K through 12 student speech at the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ultimately decided that the school had violated the students' First Amendment rights because they were simply engaged in a silent, peaceful protest that wasn't disruptive of school activities. And so the standard that the court set in that case is that unless the school authorities can show that the expression at issue would materially and substantially disrupt the school activities or curriculum, then they do not have the authority to suppress that speech. And the court made it clear that an undifferentiated fear or apprehension that some disturbance will occur is not enough to suppress speech. The mere fact that some other students might be offended by that speech or be made uncomfortable by the sight of it. And it might be difficult for people today to imagine how people could maybe care so much about a black armband protesting the Vietnam War. But at the time, right, it was a very contentious issue. And so it's not hard to imagine that students might have been made very upset with it the same way today they might become upset by seeing someone wear a shirt about how many genders there are. Right? But that's just not enough. That's not enough to justify censoring the speech. And if you apply that same principle to the case involving the student wearing a Let's Go Brandon shirt or a shirt that says there are only two genders, it really should come out the same way. This is a student engaged, in each case, in core political speech. They're commenting on in one case, the most important public figure in the United States and maybe the world, right? And sure, maybe it's not the most, refined message that they're sending, but that's never mattered for the purposes of whether or not the First Amendment applies. We don't give the government the discretion to decide which messages are sufficiently important.
And with the Let's Go Brandon, it's not obscene. So it's not like they said, F you Biden, and at which point the school officials have every right in the world, because that even matches the definition of you'll know it when you see it of obscenity that the Supreme Court lays out. That yes, that there is that one seems pretty easy to say, no, this is not acceptable. But Let's Go Brandon is not that.
Right, that's right. And yes, I should mention that there were decisions subsequent to Tinker by the Supreme Court that placed other restrictions on K-12 student speech. And one of them is the ability to regulate lewd or vulgar speech. But like you say, Let's Go Brandon, it might be, it's like a euphemism.
Sure.
Right? It's
absolutely
a way of saying this other vulgar message that isn't vulgar. So to punish that would be like punishing somebody for saying, frickin', right?
Right.
Instead of the other F word.
Right. Or HE double hockey sticks, as they used to say when I was a kid. You know?
The whole idea is that you're not saying a vulgar, you're not using vulgar language, and so that there's no justification there. And then of course there are only two genders. That's just pure expression on a contentious political issue. And there's a real danger here if we say that the school is allowed to step in and silence one side of this ongoing political debate.
So let's unpack that a little bit. The harassment standard is persistent, repeated. What am I missing?
So
there's a formula.
Severe, persistent, and objectively offensive.
There we go.
Yeah, and that actually deprives you of your ability to receive the education that you're trying to obtain when you go to school.
And so what that means is it's not simply a matter of saying, I feel or I feel unsafe, I feel that I can't. It needs to be repeated. It needs to be directed at you, not just a general statement, but directed at the individual. It needs to be persistent and severe. So there's all of these things. And again, it's always a judgment call, but it seems the shirt message doesn't fall under that.
Yeah. And the idea is that we just don't want it. We want to keep that line far out there so that we don't end up over.
And that was one of the arguments that a number of people have made in the Two Genders T-shirt case was by making the student take it off, you lose the opportunity for people who think differently to confront it and in some ways potentially engage in a conversation where the people of different opposing views can talk to one another. Sure.
That's very important. I think in a lot of these high school or K through 12 speech cases, one thing to keep in mind is what kind of lesson are we teaching to kids, about the importance of free expression and engaging in dialogue with each other. We don't want them to graduate from high school thinking that the government controlling what type of speech we can engage in, or putting its thumb on one side of the scale or the other to try and artificially tilt these political debates in one direction or another is a legitimate thing. And to be discouraged, we don't want them to be discouraged from seeking out each other and talking across differences, and not always going to reach a consensus or an agreement necessarily, right? But maybe at least gain a better understanding of the other side.
Absolutely, which is a perfect segue to the next sort of set of cases that I'm very interested in, which is the heckler's veto. So I'm sure some of our listeners will know, others will not. Talk to us about what happened at Stanford last year. They had a judge who came and spoke.
This year.
Yeah, early. Was it this year?
Yeah, I think it was in March.
Okay. It
can feel like
it feels like it was forever ago. Was it really just March? I guess it was.
So.
I think you're right. But tell us what happened and tell us why it's a problem.
Right. So the Federalist Society had invited Fifth Circuit Judge Kyle Duncan to come speak at an event
at Stanford Law School.
At Stanford Law School, that's right. And a lot of students showed up to protest, and what might have just been a protest turned into outright heckling and disruption that didn't allow Judge Duncan to get his prepared remarks out.
Right. The goal was to basically stop him from speaking.
Right. And you can see a video of this online and how disruptive it was. And what was unique about this case was at one point when Judge Duncan is standing up there and there's all this commotion going on, an administrator with Stanford Law steps up to give her own interestingly prepared remarks, where she infamously looked at Judge Duncan and asked, "Is the juice worth the squeeze? Is it worth it for you to come here and
cause this disruption
and talk about these issues that make these students so upset?
Right.
Is it worth it?" And the way I would put it is it worth it for a sitting federal judge to come to a law school?
Right.
And talk about the cases and decisions.
I think there's
I think that's always worth it.
Quite frankly, I think there's another way to interpret that comment is it worth it to hold these opinions that are so upsetting? Mm-hmm. I take it a step further. I got the sense from what I heard and read and saw is that this was very much questioning his right to hold opinions that were so anathema to the students of Stanford Law.
Yeah, well, I think she had also said something. She had made references to invalidating the student's existence and things like that. That definitely...
By holding a different opinion.
Right. That definitely suggested that his views maybe are not worthy of being aired at all.
Right.
But one of the things that's just crazy about that I was just saying is this is a sitting federal judge, right? No matter what his views are, we should want to know what those views are. And he's coming to Stanford Law. He's coming to your law school to give you this, quite frankly, very rare opportunity to tell him to his face why you think he's wrong.
Right.
If you think his views are so terrible and so evil. Here's your chance to tell him to his face why you think that's the case. And maybe you won't persuade Judge Duncan to change his mind, but it's not always about persuading the person you're talking to when you have a public audience, right? It's also about speaking to those people who are maybe undecided or they're not sure how they feel one way or the other, or maybe they do feel one way or the other, but they're open to having their minds changed. And you're not going to change anyone's mind by screaming somebody, screaming profanity at them, and not allowing them to speak. That's not persuasive, right? That's not persuasive to anybody who doesn't already agree with what you think. If you really want to change the narrative, if you want your views to be adopted more widely, and these views that you disagree with, you want to push them to the wayside, then you have to engage in dialogue, or you have to address them on the merits. You have to do it in a way that people are actually going to find persuasive. But I will say, it is important to point out that there's plenty that the protest, of course, is protected, right? So there's plenty that students can do.
Sure, and that was the difference. A quiet, the silent protest where, students are lining a hallway, maybe holding signs or what have you, but keeping their hands to themselves. That's a perfectly legitimate form of protest and using one's free expression rights to engage in its own way that is very different from trying to shout someone down.
Exactly. Yeah, if you're holding signs, handing out pamphlets, or you wait till the Q&A session of the person's talk, of Judge Duncan's talk, and then
ask really hard questions,
really hard hitting questions. Yeah. Again, you really use your own rights of free speech. That's really the difference, right? And it's important to make that distinction, and especially on a college campus, right? It's a place where you're supposed to have these freewheeling discussions of all sorts of different ideas, and also just think of the precedent that would be set, right? If what the student's conduct was deemed acceptable and legitimate, then you're risking a situation where no student group can ever successfully host a speaker. Because then what happens if the Federal Society starts deciding that they're going to go to events hosted by the college Democrats, right? And they're going to shout down, and then you just shut down all discussion.
There was one more I wanted to ask about, and that's the Hamline University, because I have not heard whether that has come to a resolution. But tell us what happened at Hamline.
Yeah, this Hamline University in Minnesota, where an art history teacher showed a medieval portrait of the Prophet Muhammad to her class. She actually gave a warning to the class before she showed it, that if this will bother you in any way to see this painting, feel free to look away. You don't have to look at it. Nevertheless,
and a piece of art done by a Muslim artist.
That's right.
This is not Charlie Hebdo, which again you and I would defend.
Still protected, right?
Still protected, but a different thing entirely. This is a Muslim artist from the 13th century.
I want something like that. Yeah, around that time. Yeah, it's supposed to be reverential.
Yes.
It's no way intended to insult the Prophet. There's different, and this is an important point, there's different schools of thought within Islam about whether it's acceptable.
And that was part of the pre-lecture. That's why she was showing it, was to say Islam is not a monolith, that there are different interpretations, and here is one painting that was done of the Prophet Muhammad, even though most Muslims today would say you would never, capture an image of, the Prophet.
Right. I believe it's Shia Muslims that are generally okay with it. If you go to Iran, where they're in the majority, apparently you can find
Persian art historically.
In people's homes, you'll find the portraits. So anyway. So a Muslim student in the class did complain, though, that it was offensive, that the professor shouldn't have shown this image. And Hamline actually sided with the student. And the quote from the university president, I believe, was that academic freedom should have been superseded by the concern for the Muslim students' feelings.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Or well-being or
well-being. Yeah. And they ended up non-renewing the professor's contract. So we made a big stink about this. We actually started a petition of faculty from around the country that I think I think got more signatures than any such petition that we had done before, because almost everyone just saw this as an outrageous attack on academic freedom to not be able to show a painting that's important to the history of art in an art history class. And just, again, the precedent that this would set for the future, if we were always to just automatically defer anytime a student complained that some type of curricular material that they had to be exposed to in class made them feel uncomfortable or offended them.
Right.
What happens when, again, you just can dream up the hypotheticals easily. An evangelical Christian student is in a biology class and they don't want to hear about the theory of evolution. That goes against maybe they're a creationist, and that goes against their beliefs, or they believe in intelligent design. So we can't have a real learning environment where anything that you teach is subject to this veto by any student in the class who's offended by it.
Right. And what I guess what I found a little bit shocking was that this professor had tried very hard to lay the groundwork, to warn students what was coming, had a purpose in showing it. It was a historically and artistically appropriate image for, again, this is not, a political cartoon, from Denmark. This is not the South Park guys doing their episode, after the Charlie, this is, it felt like this professor tried to be sensitive at every step of the way, and still that was not enough. And that is the insidiousness of this anti-First Amendment thought process.
Right. There really was no there was no way to describe this other than we have a university nominally committed to academic freedom enforcing blasphemy norms. And by the way, blasphemy norms within one part of a religion. And so essentially taking sides in an active theological debate on top of it.
Right.
Insane.
Exactly. And then on top of that, part of the American experiment is to protect minorities and not become majoritarian. But we are still talking about what was essentially, as I understand it, one student in the whole classroom. And again, it seems that it is a parallel to that heckler's veto that says, because I find this offensive, you cannot see it or hear it.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, back to any interesting cases we should be on the lookout for.
So I'm just thinking of some other trends that we've seen emerging. And it's interesting. We talked about the heckler's veto, but there have actually been some disturbing infringements on the right to protest in other contexts off campus. I actually just wrote an op-ed about a new law that was passed in Mississippi that requires you to get written permission from the police commissioner to protest on public streets and sidewalks next to a state government building.
What?
And that's, yeah.
Where else would you protest? I mean, unless you're protesting the Phillies,
Exactly.
I don't understand.
It's not really an accident that many people stage protests outside government buildings, which are often the targets of the protests. And so there's been a lot of protest activity in Jackson, Mississippi, over the past, I think, even couple of years, over a variety of different issues. The city's clean water crisis, racial issues, and other things. And so the law was passed under the guise of ensuring safety, because I think there's also been a rise in crime in Jackson. But it is really, it's just right now they're supposed to pass regulations to try and give it some more content for when they're going to, but the idea that you just have to ask permission to protest on a public sidewalk even, right, where you're not a sidewalk, you're not going to be blocking traffic or anything like that, is just flies right in the face of the First Amendment. Now, there is a coalition of groups that's suing, so there's a lawsuit ongoing in that case. The one other thing that I'll mention recently is this really bad decision out of the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals that upheld the arrest of the leader of a protest. I believe it was Black Lives Matter protest, who there was a protest outside a police station, and it got a little hectic. And at one point, somebody in the crowd threw an object at a police officer, and it was really, it was bad.
Which
it
was
severely injured him.
Arrest that person, prosecute that person, but instead they went after the organizer of the day.
Right, because I think they couldn't identify who actually threw. They said, okay, we're going to go after the organizer of the event and hold him negligent.
Right.
Because he was kind of leading this protest, and therefore he becomes responsible for the actions of the other people. That's just a really chilling precedent,
right?
And obviously going to make people reluctant to hold protests that they can get. And also, as many people have mentioned, it incentivizes people to. I'm forgetting the term now. When you kind of infiltrate a group.
Oh, right.
So someone could just infiltrate a group that they disagree with, and then commit some sort of violence, and then the people that led it will be held responsible.
Right.
So
that's
it's just
absolutely an incentive to be a bad actor and try and set up somebody who has organized a protest that you disagree with.
Yeah.
Aaron, all of those, and I appreciate your warning that we are talking about what feels like a lot of dire stuff, and that is not always the case, but it certainly is of concern. And the First Amendment, we are lucky to have fire get us back to something, because it has been so dark and dreary talking about First Amendment rights being endangered. So just a few questions, no homework necessary. Excluding Washington and Lincoln, who's your favorite president?
All right, so excluding my two favorites.
Yes. We had to make this hard.
I would say, I think I would say Thomas Jefferson.
Okay, Jefferson.
But kind of considering his whole career, not just his presidency.
Not just the presidency.
But of course, a big advocate of free expression.
Yes.
So I think I'd probably go with Jefferson after.
Okay. I would have thought maybe Madison, since he did write
you know what? That's
the First Amendment.
Yeah, I feel like I am giving Madison short shrift here.
Everyone does.
Yeah.
He needs his own. He needs the next Broadway musical.
Yeah. I think it's also good. I probably am answering that way because I went to UVA.
Oh, so I was gonna. Yes, we didn't bring that up, but you did go to UVA, and that is Jefferson country. So, what's one thing you want every American to learn more about?
Ooh, just in general.
Yeah, anything. What should people learn more about?
So I won't say free speeches because I feel like that's the predictable answer. And we're trying to talk about something else for a minute. Meditation.
Oh, interesting.
And the benefits of mindfulness meditation and other forms of meditation. I got into it a few years ago, and I think it's truly life-changing. I think it's a way to ensure that you don't go through your life not examining any part of it. And it sort of takes you off autopilot, and can really, if you really get into it, you can arrive at, I think, great insights about the nature of your mind and just your existence.
Oh, that's great.
And for people who think it's just kind of like just spiritual nonsense, I thought that for many years until I actually started doing it. You don't need any of the kind of weird spiritual baggage.
Crystals.
You don't need crystals. Yeah, you don't need to fully accept all the tenets of Zen Buddhism to just start meditating and to kind of observe your mind and get a better understanding of how it works.
Well, and it does make sense that, in that, there are these great both Western and Eastern traditions of meditation and mysticism that are connected to, this modern idea of the practice of mindfulness, that it's like there's got to be something there. And so thank you for sharing that. If you had not become a lawyer, what do you think you would have done?
A scientist?
I was going to say, would you still be in Manitoba? That's the question.
So I think so, but I would have went a somewhat different direction where I wasn't in northern Manitoba taking soil cores out of frozen ground. I think I would have tried to do something more that's just studying the evolution of some species or something along those lines.
Okay.
The career that I would want to do that I don't think I would ever have the talent and ability to would be a musician, professional musician. But it's just something that's just a hobby for me.
What pet peeve annoys you the most?
Too many questions at the end of it. No, I'm kidding. I'm going to say Philadelphia drivers.
Oh, excellent.
I don't know if that's really a pet peeve.
Well, I'll add to that. I'll say yes and, as they say in comedy. Out of town drivers driving in a city like Philadelphia. You know, every time I get cut off by somebody with Jersey plates, it's like, you should not be allowed to drive in the city. Like, you just, shouldn't. Some people should just park and Uber into the city, and that'll be fine.
Yeah. And by the way, it's not just when you're in a car, but I find even just when you're a pedestrian and the light turns green and cars just start turning in front of you. It's like, that doesn't even happen in New York City. They always let you walk across before they just...
That's so true. Our Philly drivers have their own rules.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But yes, lots of driving pet peeves. Absolutely. What's your favorite movie?
Goodfellas.
Okay. What one thing about you would most people be surprised to learn?
I performed in my law school's sketch comedy show and I wrote and performed in my law school's sketch comedy show.
Okay.
Just another.
I like that.
Yeah.
That's great.
That was fun.
If you could meet one historical person, who would it be?
I actually think I would want to meet Jesus.
Okay.
And I'm not a religious person, actually, but I want, or maybe, or any you can insert any religious prophet, because I just would want to see what they're like. They must have such incredibly charismatic.
We've got this handful of historic persons, whether it's Muhammad, it's Jesus, it's Buddha, who we know lived, and yet everybody, knows who they are. They've had this effect that has been centuries long. Like, what is it about that human person that the whole world was changed?
Right. Because I feel like I would meet them, and it would almost be impossible not to be disappointed, though. Yeah. Because you would expect them to there would be this aura around them that's just indescribable. But really, I mean, on some level, they were human beings, right? Yeah. Well, I mean, some people believe they were more than human beings,
they might have been more, but for each of those religions, they were humans. They might have been more than humans, but they were, yes.
On earth, they were manifested as kind of flawed human beings, right?
Right.
So it would be interesting to see and what is it about them that's so magnetic and that is able to have this influence that spans thousands of years. It's incredible even to think that that's possible.
Fascinating. Last question: bourbon or scotch?
Bourbon.
Excellent.
But I like both.
Yes, I do too. I'm one of those weirdos who likes both, but bourbon is winning, and for a podcast about American liberty, that's a good thing.
That's right.
Aaron, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So thank you to our guests, Aaron. Thank you to our listeners, to our producers, Laura, Kennedy, and Sarah Rasmussen. A special thanks. Also to friend of the pod, Bill Franz, for his art design on the logo. Special thanks to longtime Freedom's Foundation historic interpreter Bob Gleason for his contributions to the intro. And most of all, thank you to our listeners. Please subscribe, follow, rate, and review George Washington Slept Here wherever you listen to podcasts, and tell your friends. Learn more about Freedom's Foundation at Valley Forge by checking out our website, freedomsfoundation.org, and follow us on social media or email us at gwshpodcast@gmail.com with your comments, questions, or suggestions. And we'll talk to you next time.